The air in the barn was thick with dust, the sun setting low enough to bleed amber through the cracks in the wooden walls. Maddox stood there, motionless, his hand still clutching the weathered reins of the horse he was about to saddle. He wasn't a man who spoke much, never had been. Words were for those who needed to explain themselves. But today, the silence felt different, heavier. A woman stood in front of him, her eyes wide, filled with desperation. She wasn't from around here. That much was clear. Her clothes were too fine, too clean for this part of the world. She had ridden in on a horse that wasn't much better than a show pony. And now, here she was, asking for the impossible. "I'm begging you," she said, her voice cracking, like a dried leaf breaking apart in the wind. Maddox didn't answer. His eyes, steady and unflinching, were fixed on the horse's saddle, as though he could see something in its worn leather that held his attention. Her words had to be real. They couldn't be the ramblings of a desperate woman trying to barter her way out of something she couldn't handle. But something about her, the way she stood, the way she moved, told him this wasn't a simple transaction. "I'll give you anything," she pleaded again, her voice lower now, tinged with something far more dangerous than fear. Maddox knew that tone. It wasn't just desperation anymore. It was a plea for survival. Her back was pressed against the rough wood of the barn, and he could feel the weight of her gaze even without looking up. She was waiting for him to say something, anything. But he remained quiet. His hands, calloused and strong, continued working the saddle. "I just need you to pretend," she said. "Pretend you're my husband for one day. That's all." Maddox's jaw tightened, the muscles underneath his skin pulling, as if considering the request. He didn't have much, but what he had, he earned with his sweat and blood. A man's word was his bond, and once it was given, there was no taking it back. But she was asking for something far worse than a word. She was asking for his name, his reputation, his honor, and Maddox wasn't sure he was ready to lose those. Not for anyone. 10,000, she said, cutting through his thoughts like a knife through skin. "Cash. In your hands. If you just walk with me, stand beside me at the altar and keep your mouth shut. I'll even pay you double if you don't say a word the whole time." Her words hung in the air, almost too absurd to believe. But the way her eyes held his wide, almost frantic, told him she wasn't lying. Maddox ran his tongue over his lips. "And what happens after?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was enough to raise the hair on the back of his neck. "You don't need to worry about that," she said, her voice dipping into a shadowed place. Maddox thought about it. 10,000 was enough to buy him more than just a horse or a place to call home. It was enough to buy him time, enough to get out of this dust-choked town and into something better, something quieter. Hell, it might even be enough to leave this whole cursed world behind. But there was no way he was walking into that church without knowing what kind of trouble he was getting into. "Why me?" he asked, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed, studying her. "You got plenty of men around here, plenty of people who could play along with your game." Her lips parted, as though she were going to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes flickering over his rough clothes, the dirt staining his boots, the exhaustion etched into his face from years of work. She must have seen something in him that the others hadn't, something that made her think he was the one who would keep his mouth shut. Or maybe she had already seen the world of hurt that came with making promises you couldn't keep. She wasn't asking for protection. She was asking for something else entirely. "Because," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the floor, "I'm not running from just anyone. I'm running from a man who doesn't take kindly to being turned down." Maddox stiffened. Now he understood. The money, the fear, the urgency, they weren't just because she needed a husband for a day. They were because she was trying to outrun a man who would hunt her down if she didn't comply. He didn't know who she was running from, but he knew this wasn't the kind of thing you could undo with just a few coins. He stepped back from the horse and turned to face her fully, his face now hardening like stone. 10,000's a lot of money, ma'am, but it's not enough to turn a man's life upside down. You want me to walk into a church, pretend to be your husband, and what? What happens when the preacher says I do? You think you can just walk away from that? Her eyes met his again, and there was something different in them this time, a quiet desperation that nearly made him second-guess everything. I don't want to run anymore, Maddox, she whispered. But if I don't do this, I won't be running alone. He'll come for me. He'll come for both of us. The silence between them stretched, the weight of her words pressing against his chest like a mountain. Maddox knew what it meant to run. He'd done it his whole life, run from trouble, run from debt, run from bad decisions. But this wasn't about running anymore. This was about survival. And so, as the barn grew quieter with the nightfall, Maddox made a decision. It was the last thing he thought he would ever do, but when he looked into her eyes one more time, the choice was clear. He nodded once. I'll do it, he said, his voice like gravel. But you'll owe me more than 10,000. You'll owe me a way out of whatever mess you've dragged me into. Her breath caught, relief flooding her face. She was too quick to smile, as if she hadn't expected him to agree. Thank you, she whispered, and for the first time, Maddox saw a glimmer of something in her eyes, something real, something human, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the real trouble was only just beginning. The town was quiet, the morning of the wedding too quiet. The dust that had been swirling relentlessly for days had settled, leaving the streets dry and still, like a long-forgotten memory. Maddox stood outside the church, his hand resting on the cold metal of the hitching post, eyes scanning the horizon. He had never been to a wedding before. No reason to. A man like him didn't have much use for vows or promises. He'd seen too many men break them, men who swore to protect their families, their land, their lives, only to turn their backs when things got tough. Maddox had learned early that promises were nothing but a weight around your neck, and yet, here he was, about to make one. His gaze shifted to the church doors, which were open just wide enough to let in the faint sound of the organ playing inside. The sound was both foreign and familiar, the kind of music that made a man uneasy. It was supposed to be a celebration, but to Maddox, it felt more like the calm before a storm. He adjusted his collar, straightened his jacket, and tugged at the cuffs of his sleeves. The clothes weren't his, too fine, too pressed. He hadn't worn anything like this since he was a boy, sitting on the porch while his mother read him stories of men in suits, men who shook hands with a firm grip and looked people in the eye. But Maddox wasn't a boy anymore. And today, he wasn't a rancher either. Today, he was something else entirely. The woman, the one who had walked into his barn asking for help, had gone inside hours ago. She hadn't said a word to him since their agreement. She had disappeared into the church with nothing but the rustle of her dress and the look in her eyes. He could only guess what she was feeling. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like, standing there, preparing to marry a stranger. But then again, he wasn't much of a stranger. He had given her his word, even if that word meant walking into something he could never back out of. It wasn't about the money anymore. Hell, it hadn't been for a while. It was about what came after. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The church bell rang, its sound so loud that it rattled the bones in his chest. It was time. Maddox took a deep breath and turned toward the doors, making his way up the steps, his boots echoing against the worn wood. Inside, the pews were filled with townsfolk, mostly quiet, their heads bowed in reverence or anticipation, though there was an edge to the air, a whispering undertone. He could feel it, like the murmur of a storm just before the rain came. At the front of the church, a preacher stood, his eyes focused on the altar as if he were performing a ritual he had done 100 times before. He didn't look up as Maddox approached. No reason to. Maddox wasn't the one anyone was waiting for. The woman was already standing there, her back straight, her hands clasped together in front of her. She was dressed in white, a gown that seemed out of place in this world of dust and rust. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face a mask of calm. But Maddox knew better. He could see the tightness around her eyes, the way her breath came in shallow gasps. She wasn't calm, she was just hiding it. He moved to stand beside her, feeling every pair of eyes in the room shift toward him. The congregation was silent, waiting. The preacher cleared his throat, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. "We are gathered here today in the eyes of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Maddox barely heard the words. His mind was elsewhere, running over the conversation they had the night before. The woman's eyes, wide with fear, had pleaded with him to do this, to walk into the church and pretend to be something he wasn't, to stand by her side as her husband, even though she wasn't his wife and he wasn't hers. It wasn't supposed to be real. It was supposed to be a farce, a ruse, a way for her to escape whatever threat was chasing her. But what if that wasn't enough? What if it wasn't just about a man coming for her? What if there was more to this story? Something she hadn't told him. Maddox glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, noting the way her hands trembled slightly, the way her body stiffened when the preacher's gaze passed over them both. She was afraid, more than he'd realized. The preacher continued, and Maddox's thoughts faded into the background as the ceremony moved forward. The vows were exchanged, spoken in formal, clipped tones. They were meaningless, just words, nothing more. But when the preacher turned to Maddox and asked, "Do you, Maddox, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" something in his chest tightened. His voice didn't waver when he said, "I do." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the preacher turned to her. "And do you, Margaret, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" Maddox noticed her eyes flicker to the preacher, her lips parting slightly as if the words were caught in her throat. She hesitated for just a moment, but in that moment, everything seemed to shift. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I do," she said, her voice steady but lacking the conviction Maddox had expected. The preacher smiled and nodded. Then, "By the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words were final, and just like that, a new chapter began, one that Maddox wasn't sure he was ready for. He turned to her, and she looked at him. In that moment, her face softened. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was his wife. But for how long? As the congregation clapped, and the church doors opened to reveal the bright sunlight of the afternoon, Maddox knew the real test had just begun. He wasn't sure what it was that lay ahead, but he knew it wasn't going to be simple. And whatever it was something he couldn't walk away from. Not now. Not after everything. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty town. The church bells still rang in his ears as Maddox stepped out into the bright daylight. His wife, or so the preacher had called her, by his side. Her hand was warm against his, and for a brief moment, he almost felt the weight of their marriage as real as anything else in this world. But then, the reality of it hit him. This was all a lie. A lie he had agreed to, but a lie nonetheless. The hand that gripped his wasn't out of love. It wasn't out of commitment. It was simply the desperate plea of a woman running from something, someone. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes flickering nervously to the left and right, scanning the crowd of onlookers as if they were all potential threats. Her body was stiff, her lips pressed tightly together, and every step she took seemed calculated, as though she were walking a fine line between freedom and danger. They moved slowly down the church steps, their every move followed by the eyes of the town. Some of the faces were curious, others downright suspicious. None of them knew the truth that this was no union of love or choice, but a survival tactic. As they reached the bottom of the steps, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, his face weathered by years of hard living. His eyes, though, were sharp, like a predator's. He looked at Maddox for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Margaret. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice low but carrying across the quiet street. "Looks like the little bird found herself a cage." Maddox didn't flinch, but he felt the muscles in his neck tighten. He had seen men like this before, the kind that had no respect for anyone or anything but themselves. They were the predators of the world, and it didn't matter who or what got in their way. Margaret's grip on his hand tightened, and her eyes locked on the man like she was trying to will him out of existence. But the man wasn't going anywhere. "Who the hell are you?" Maddox asked, his voice steady, but the coldness in his tone betrayed his true feelings. The man's lips curled into a grin. "Name's Thorn, and I reckon you're the lucky son of a bitch who got roped into this little game." Maddox's hand slid down to the revolver at his hip. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a thunderstorm. He knew the rules of this game, and right now, it was a game of intimidation. Margaret didn't say a word, her eyes locked on Thorn, her breath shallow. She looked like she was trying to shrink into herself, like she wanted to disappear. "Let's get one thing clear, cowboy," Thorn continued, his grin widening. "You might think you've made yourself a good deal, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Maddox kept his hand steady on the revolver. He wasn't about to let some damn fool threaten him in the middle of the street. "You want to take this any further, Thorn?" Thorn's grin faltered for just a second, but it was enough to let Maddox know that, for once, he wasn't the one who was going to back down. He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. But before things could escalate, Margaret spoke up, her voice low but clear. "Let's go, Maddox. It's not worth it." Maddox didn't take his eyes off Thorn, but he could feel the weight of her words, the silent plea in her voice. This wasn't his fight. Not yet. He nodded, his hand slowly retreating from his gun. "This ain't over, Thorn," Maddox muttered, turning to walk away. "Stay out of my way." For a long moment, Thorn didn't speak, and when he did, it was barely a whisper. "You'll regret it, cowboy." Maddox didn't look back. Instead, he took Margaret's hand in his grip firm, and led her toward the small house on the edge of town that she'd rented for them. The walk to the house was silent, the air heavy with unspoken words. Margaret kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and Maddox couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this point. They reached the house in silence, the door creaking open as Maddox led her inside. It wasn't much. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. But it was clean, and in this world, clean was about all you could ask for. Maddox closed the door behind them and stood there for a moment, taking in the room. His eyes flickered over to Margaret, who had already moved to the small table in the corner, her back to him. She was staring out the window, her hands pressed against the glass, her fingers trembling. He watched her for a long time, the silence between them growing heavier by the second. But eventually, he couldn't stand it anymore. "You never told me what happened, Margaret," he said, his voice steady but filled with a raw intensity. "Why'd you need me to pretend to be your husband? What are you running from?" She didn't turn to face him right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, her hands falling to her sides as she finally spoke. "I'm not just running from Thorn," she said quietly, her voice distant, almost hollow. "I'm running from everything I've ever known, from a life I can never go back to." Maddox took a step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? What kind of life?" Margaret hesitated, then turned slowly to face him. Her eyes were wide with something Maddox couldn't quite place: fear, yes, but also something deeper, something more vulnerable. "I was part of something," she said softly. "A group, a family. But they're not like any family you know. They make their own rules, their own laws, and Thorn is just one of them. A small piece of a much larger machine. A machine that has its claws in every part of this country." And now, I'm in too deep. Maddox took another step toward her, the weight of her words sinking in. And you think pretending to be married to me is going to get you out? Margaret nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. It's my only chance. Thorn thinks he's got me under his thumb. But if I can convince him I'm untouchable, if I can make him think I'm already someone else's problem, maybe, just maybe, he'll leave me alone. Maddox was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd just told him. He wasn't sure what to think. Part of him wanted to walk away, wanted to forget this whole mess and head back to his ranch, back to a life where he didn't have to deal with criminals and lies. But another part of him, the part that had agreed to help her in the first place, couldn't let her face this alone. You're not alone, Margaret, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I'm not leaving. Not until this is over. Her eyes flickered to him, and for a brief moment, there was something like hope in them. But it was fleeting, just as quickly as it had appeared. This won't end until Thorn gets what he wants, she whispered, her voice breaking. And what he wants is me. But if he thinks I'm already taken. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Maddox felt a flicker of something deep inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Then we'll make him believe it, he said, his voice steady and sure. We'll make him believe it so damn hard that he'll regret ever crossing you. Margaret didn't speak again, but the look in her eyes was enough. For the first time since they'd met, Maddox felt like he understood her. She wasn't just running from a man. She was running from a life, a past that she could never escape unless she fought for it. And Maddox, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, found himself fighting beside her. The town of Dry Creek seemed smaller under the weight of the night. The distant calls of coyotes echoed across the empty streets, while the porch light flickered like a dying star. In the small house that had become their refuge, the shadows seemed longer, more pronounced. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of dried wood clung to every corner. It had been hours since Maddox had sent the man, the one who claimed to be Thorn's messenger, on his way, but the encounter lingered in the air like smoke. Maddox sat at the small table, his back to the window, but he could still feel the weight of the dark outside pressing in. His thoughts churned, moving faster than he could catch them. His hand absent-mindedly ran over the rough edge of the table, the smooth grain of the wood cool under his fingertips. Every few seconds, he would glance up, as though expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway. But it was always empty. Margaret, on the other hand, had hardly moved. She had been sitting by the window since the man left, her back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and her fingers trembled ever so slightly. She hadn't said a word since the messenger's visit, and that silence spoke volumes. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Maddox had never been good at sitting still. He was used to action, to working with his hands, to using his body to carve out the life he'd built. Sitting in silence, waiting for something to happen, wasn't in his nature. He needed to act. He needed to do something before the storm hit. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Margaret didn't even flinch, as though she were lost in her thoughts, as though nothing in this room could rattle her anymore. But Maddox knew better. She was hanging on by a thread. "Maddox," she said suddenly, her voice low but firm, "what are we going to do?" Her question seemed simple enough, but the weight of it hung in the air. It wasn't just a question about their next move. It was a question about everything they had left. The truth was, neither of them knew what to do. They had come this far on instinct, but instinct wasn't going to save them now. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of frustration. He moved to the window and looked outside, his gaze scanning the empty street. "But we don't have much time." Margaret turned to face him, her expression filled with uncertainty. "Maddox, you don't understand. Thorn isn't just some lowlife who can be intimidated. He's part of something bigger. He has a whole network. People who do things who do unspeakable things. Maddox turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze. What exactly are you telling me, Margaret? That we're dealing with some kind of organized crime syndicate? Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes clouded with a mix of fear and regret. It's worse than that. Thorn isn't the leader, Maddox. He's just a soldier. He's part of a larger operation. I've seen things, been a part of things that no one should ever have to experience. Maddox took a step closer to her, his voice low but firm. And you think I'm just going to let him take you back into that world? Margaret looked away, her fingers twisting in her lap. I don't have a choice. I never had a choice, Maddox. The words hung in the air between them like a ghost, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind outside. Maddox could feel the weight of her words sinking in, the realization that she wasn't just a victim in this, she was a part of something much darker than he had imagined. And if he was going to protect her, he needed to understand it all. He couldn't keep walking blindly into this world. Tell me everything, he said, his voice low and resolute. Margaret hesitated. She seemed to wrestle with her thoughts for a moment before standing up slowly, her back straight and her shoulders tense. She crossed the room, then turned back to face him. Her eyes were still filled with fear, but there was something else there now, something like resolve. I wasn't always like this, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't always live this way. She took a deep breath, the words seemingly difficult to pull from her lips. I was born into a different life, a life where promises meant something. I was supposed to marry a man named Thomas. He was everything I ever wanted, strong, kind, the kind of man you could trust. She paused, the memory of that time clearly still painful. But Thomas was different. He wasn't just a farmer. He was involved in things I didn't understand at the time. Small-time deals, things that didn't seem dangerous. But eventually, those small deals turned into something bigger. Thomas got involved with the wrong people, and one day, I found myself caught in the middle. Maddox stood still, watching her. What kind of people? The kind who don't take no for an answer, she said bitterly. The kind who make you an offer you can't refuse. The kind who use violence to get what they want. Thorn was one of them. He worked for the family, the people who ran the operation. He was the muscle, the enforcer. And eventually, he came after me. Maddox's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't need to hear the rest of the story to know what had happened. He forced you to marry him, didn't he? Margaret nodded, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. He came into my life like a shadow. He threatened me, threatened Thomas. I was supposed to be the prize, the payment. But when I tried to escape, they found me. And Thomas, she stopped herself, her voice breaking. Thomas paid the price. Maddox felt a surge of anger rise within him. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she had endured, the kind of fear that had shaped her. But he also knew this, no one was going to take her again. Not on his watch. Is that why you came to me? Because you thought Thorn wouldn't hurt you if you were already promised to someone else? Margaret looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think anyone would help me. And then you came along, and I thought, maybe I could escape. Maybe you'd be the one to save me. Maddox reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm but gentle. You're not alone in this, Margaret. We'll figure it out together. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with both hope and terror. I don't know how to get out of this, Maddox. Thorn won't stop. He won't rest until I'm back with him. And if he thinks I'm hiding out here, pretending to be someone else's wife, he'll burn this town down to the ground to find me. Maddox's eyes hardened with resolve. He wasn't going to let that happen. Then we don't wait for him to come to us. We make the first move. Margaret shook her head. You don't understand. I've tried running before, and they always find me. They always come for me, no matter where I go. Maddox's voice was steady, unwavering. Then we fight. We fight back, and we make sure they never take you again. Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, it seemed like she was looking for something she hadn't found in anyone else. You really think we can win this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Maddox admitted, but I'm not going to sit here and wait for him to come for us. We'll find a way. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't a quiet kind of silence. It was the kind of silence that filled the room with tension, the kind that signified a turning point, a moment when everything changed. They both knew that they were no longer just trying to survive. They were preparing to fight for something much bigger than themselves. Maddox walked over to the table, his mind already working through a plan. We need information. We need to know exactly who we're up against. And we need to get to Thorn before he gets to us. Margaret nodded, her face filled with a mix of fear and determination. I can help you with that. I know how he thinks. I know the people he works with. Maddox stopped in his tracks. You're not doing this alone, Margaret. If we're going to do this, we do it together. No more running, no more hiding. She looked at him, her eyes filled with something like gratitude, or perhaps it was just the exhaustion of the past few days catching up to her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Maddox nodded. We're in this together, and we're going to make sure Thorn never hurts you again. The wind howled across the plains, a cold, biting force that swept through Dry Creek like a restless spirit. It carried with it the dust of the desert, clinging to the buildings and creeping into the cracks of the houses. The town, once so peaceful, had become a powder keg, and everyone knew it. The question wasn't if it would explode, but when. Maddox sat on the porch of the small house, his rifle resting across his lap, the weight of it familiar and comforting. His mind was elsewhere, his thoughts as sharp and jagged as the mountains on the horizon. Margaret stood beside him, her eyes scanning the street, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been quiet for the past few hours, her fear still evident but tempered with resolve. She was no longer the fragile woman who had walked into his barn, asking for help. She was something more now, something stronger. They both knew the time was drawing near. Thorn was coming, and this time, there would be no running. There would be no hiding. There would be no more pretending. Maddox had spent the last few hours preparing. He had gathered whatever weapons he could find, loading his revolvers, checking his rifle, and making sure the ammunition was secure. But it wasn't just the guns that had his attention. It was the plan. They needed a way to face Thorn and his men, a way to take the fight to them before they had the chance to get their hands on her again. The town had gone quiet, almost too quiet, and it was starting to feel like the calm before a storm. The usual sounds of life, the creaking of doors, the rattle of wagon wheels had disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence that hung over everything. Maddox knew the men would come at dusk, just like they always did. It was the perfect time for an ambush too dark to see clearly, too close to escape. Margaret turned to him, her expression unreadable. Do you think it will work? She asked, her voice steady but laced with doubt. Maddox looked at her, his gaze unwavering. It has to. We don't have another choice. There was a long pause, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Margaret's lips pressed together, her eyes flickering to the distant hills. And after this, Maddox, after we do this, what happens? He didn't immediately answer, instead standing up and moving to the edge of the porch. The town stretched out before him, a mix of old buildings and cracked roads, all of it bathed in the fading light of the evening sun. It was a place that had been untouched by the outside world for too long, and now, it was about to be changed forever. We fight to survive, he said, his voice low but resolute. And if we make it through, we start over, together. Margaret stepped up beside him, her body close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. I don't know if I can start over, Maddox. After all this, He turned to face her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You'll never be alone. I won't let you go through this again. Not alone." She nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The sound of horses broke the silence, distant at first but growing louder with every passing second. The men were coming. Maddox's heart rate quickened, his grip on the rifle tightening. He glanced at Margaret, his eyes locking with hers. "Stay inside," he ordered. His voice brooked no argument. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Maddox shook his head, his expression hardening. "This isn't your fight. I won't risk you getting caught in the middle of it." For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes filled with frustration, but then she nodded. "Be careful, Maddox." He didn't answer, his gaze already fixed on the horizon. The first of Thorne's men appeared, silhouettes against the setting sun, moving slowly toward the town. They were on horseback, their figures dark and ominous against the backdrop of the fading light. There were 4 of them, each one armed and dangerous, and behind them, Maddox could just make out the shape of Thorne, the man who had caused all this trouble. Maddox didn't wait any longer. He moved quickly to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the area for cover. There was a small shed to the left, just behind the barn. It would do. He motioned for Margaret to stay put before disappearing into the shadows. From his vantage point behind the shed, he could see them clearly now. Thorne's men were spread out, taking their time as they approached the house. They were confident, not expecting any resistance. They believed this would be just another easy job, another woman to claim as their own. They didn't know Maddox. They didn't know what he was capable of. Thorne was the last to approach, his horse kicking up dust as he slowed to a stop in front of the house. He was tall, with a face that was both hard and weathered, like someone who had seen too much and still hadn't learned a damn thing. His eyes locked onto the house, his lips curling into a smirk. He didn't see Maddox yet. He didn't see the trap closing in on him. Maddox's hand hovered over the rifle, waiting for the right moment. He knew he had to act fast. One shot, and the rest of the men would scatter. It was the only chance they had. Thorne spoke, his voice carrying across the stillness of the evening. "Margaret," he called, his tone mocking. "Come on out, sweetheart. It's time to go home." Maddox's fingers tightened on the rifle. He had seen enough. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and clear in the still air, and one of Thorne's men fell from his horse, a spray of red marking the dirt beneath him. The other 3 reacted immediately, drawing their guns and looking around in confusion. Thorne's eyes widened in shock, and for the briefest moment, he seemed frozen in place. That moment was all Maddox needed. He moved quickly, stepping out from behind the shed and into the open, his rifle raised. Another shot rang out, this one striking the second man in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. The remaining 2 men turned to face him, their guns drawn, but they weren't fast enough. Maddox's next shot was swift, precise. The third man dropped before he could even fire a shot, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. That left only Thorne. The final confrontation came fast. Thorne was already drawing his own weapon, his eyes filled with rage. But Maddox was faster. He took a step forward, raising the rifle once more. But this time, he didn't fire. Instead, he spoke, his voice cold and deadly. "Stay where you are, Thorne," Maddox warned, his eyes never leaving the man. "You don't have to die here today, but if you take one more step, I will make sure you do." Thorne's lips curled into a sneer, and he raised his gun, his hand shaking with anger. "You think you've won, cowboy," he spat. "You think you can stop me? I'm just a part of something bigger, something you'll never understand." Maddox didn't blink. "I don't need to understand. I just need to make sure you never hurt anyone again." For a moment, there was a tense standoff between the 2 men. the distance between them filled with nothing but hatred and desperation. Then, with a move too fast for anyone to see, Thorne lunged forward, his gun aimed at Maddox's chest. But it was too late. Maddox had already moved, stepping to the side and bringing his rifle up in a swift, fluid motion. The shot rang out, and Thorne's body jerked as the bullet struck him in the chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide in disbelief, before he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was deafening. Maddox stood there for a moment, the rifle still raised, his breath coming in short gasps. He didn't feel the rush of victory. He didn't feel the triumph of having won. What he felt was the weight of everything he had just done, everything he had just risked. Slowly, he lowered the rifle, his eyes scanning the bodies of the men who had come to take Margaret. They were all dead, their lives taken in the blink of an eye. He turned and walked back toward the house, his footsteps heavy against the dirt. As he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder one last time, making sure there were no other threats. Margaret was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She had heard the gunfire, but she had not witnessed the fight. She had no idea how close they had come to losing everything. Maddox stepped inside, his hand reaching for hers. "It's over," he said quietly, but Margaret didn't move. She stood there, staring at him, her lips trembling. "Is it really over, Maddox? Or is this just the beginning?" Maddox didn't have an answer. He only knew one thing: he had protected her, and for now, that was enough.